In my last listener survey, writers asked for more editing strategies. Today, I am beyond thrilled to share a conversation with someone whose wisdom, depth, and counterintuitive approach to life and writing will inspire you in ways you may not expect. Sarah Chauncey is a veteran writer, developmental editor, and the author of P.S. I Love You More Than Tuna, the first gift book for adults grieving the loss of a pet. Her career spans entertainment writing for VH1, Comedy Central, and Much Music to storytelling for organizations like NASA, McAfee, and Intel. But what makes Sarah's journey truly extraordinary is the profound spiritual transformation she had in 2010 that led to the insights she shares through her Substack, The Counterintuitive Guide to Life. Join us as we dive into what it means to write in a year like 2025, as well as the inner and outer work of editing, the power of allowing rather than forcing, and why true creative flow often comes from stepping away from the keyboard. Grab your pen, open your heart, and let's dive into this conversation. Welcome to Writing Your Resilience, a podcast for writers who want to create stories that change lives, especially their own. I'm your host, Lisa Cooper Ellison. As a writer and trauma-informed writing coach, I'm here to guide you on a transformative journey through the art of writing, self-discovery, and resilience. Each week, I'll share my best tricks, tips, and strategies to help you write more authentically, craft deeper, truer stories, and overcome the common storytelling roadblocks we all face. Together, we'll explore how to bounce back when life gets tough and stay connected to your inner calling. So grab your pen, your notebook, and an open heart. It's time to do the work that changes the world, one story at a time. Hi, I'm Lisa Cooper Ellison, and I am excited to invite you to join me on March 5th for my course, Memoir Backstory. If you're a memoirist, you know that backstory is a crucial part of your memoir, but it can be so tricky to figure out how much to include and how to weave it in without overwhelming your story. In this webinar hosted by Jane Friedman, you'll discover what to keep, what to cut, and what to repurpose so that you can write a captivating story while also working on your author platform. Best of all, this webinar is only $25. To register, go to janefriedman.com/memoir backstory with Lisa Cooper Ellison or click on the link in the show notes. I look forward to seeing you on March 5th. Well, hello, Sarah. Welcome to the Writing Your Resilience podcast. I am so glad that you're on today and just welcome.
Thank you so much, Lisa. I have really been wanting to be on this secretly. So thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Well, my desire to have you on has not been so secret. So I was so glad when you said yes, because we are going to have a deep conversation. I already know that about 2025 and what we're going to do as writers and how we can navigate the writing and editing process at a time that could be big, has a lot of unknowns, could contain some tumult. We don't know where it's going to go, but there's a lot of energy and expectation around it.
Yeah, a big year.
Definitely going to be a big year. And when I was looking at my horoscope for the year, it said, buckle up, a change is a coming.
Yeah.
I am buckling up and taking good care of myself, and writing is going to play a huge role in that.
Yes.
And so we're going to get into the inner and outer work we need to do in order to edit our writing. But before we get to that, I want to give you an opportunity to tell us what you'd like us to know about you and your work as a writing coach.
Well, thanks. I primarily work as a developmental editor with nonfiction writers, including memoirists. And I really like working with nonfiction writers because I've had a very eclectic career. And so I've built these storytelling tools from film and television and all these different mediums. And I like teaching them these techniques that generally academics, journalists, physicians aren't taught. But I also really love troubleshooting story. So I have a couple of clients who are general fiction writers, and I just love brainstorming kind of, okay, where are we going to go with this? And what's the most unexpected piece here?
Yes.
And then as a coach, I work with all kinds of writers. And my main focus is in helping writers not only become better at their craft, but also we were talking about the inside and the outside work,
Yeah.
really learn about their own creative rhythms and process,
Mm-hmm.
which is something that I spent years doing, and learning how to kind of make the most of writing time by attuning,
Yes.
learning to notice their thoughts and what they're daydreaming about and what ideas come up in the shower or when they're, mowing the lawn, that kind of thing. And then how to incorporate that.
Yeah, I was reading one of your newsletter posts, and I know that you have two different newsletters. We're going to talk today about the Counterintuitive Guide for Living, and that's one of the things we're going to talk about. But you also have one for writers on writing,
Yes.
and you talk a lot about the role of the unconscious. You also
Yes.
talked about this in a blog post that you wrote for Jane Friedman, which we're going to share in the show notes so people can read
Oh,
it
great.
because it was brilliant.
Thanks.
It really was. And I love that you talk about the role of the unconscious and how it impacts the writing that we do, because it is such a powerful part of the process and it's a dismissed part of the process.
Yes, very much. I have to say, for people who are new writers and for writers who are just getting started, there is a benefit to the button chair, hands on keyboard, just stick it out. Because
Yes.
sometimes magic does happen that way.
Mm-hmm.
But after a certain point, you can spend a lot of time cranking out crap
Mm-hmm.
and staying at the keyboard. I often tell clients, it's not like carpentry. If you hammer harder, that's not necessarily better. One of the big things that I encourage in both newsletters, actually in all three, is allowing more than trying. This is one of the
Yes.
counterintuitive pieces, is that if you're stuck, getting up and going for a walk, in my experience, over and over, something will come up as you're moving. And just when
Mm-hmm.
you stop thinking about it, it's sort of the same concept as, a watched pot never boils. It's
Yes.
like the harder we try, the more elusive it is because we're trying from the intellect. And
Mm-hmm.
creativity is not an intellectual process. Revision can be, but creativity as a trait isn't.
Absolutely. And I tell the writers that I work with to go for walks all the time. And I find myself doing that. And, as a writer, I can't tell you the number of times that I've had this thought, this should thought, which you and I were talking about how much of writing and publishing is influenced by our capitalistic society and
Yeah,
all of the influences around it, this idea that we have to create products. And then I'll have this thought like, oh, I haven't published an essay in a while. I should
right.
publish an essay. So then I'm sitting down and I'm trying to brainstorm all of these ideas. And, sometimes I'll pitch them and they won't work. But every time I go for a walk and I get quiet and I listen to the still small voice inside myself that says, do this. And if
Mhm.
it says it in this really loud way, like write this thing, and I listen, it'll get published.
Yeah. Ironically, I have a post that's on the impact of mindfulness on creativity. And that was one of the first posts that just flew out of me. Barely any revision. Like I had been walking for a couple of hours. I sat down, it just poured out. I made a couple of adjustments, and there it was, which is, for anyone who knows me, like not at all how I usually write. I can revise for years, literally,
Mm-hmm.
even a blog post.
I want people to hear that. You can revise for years. And
Yes.
it's so important for people to hear that because they think it's got to be quick.
Yes, because we live in this hustle culture that's all about
Yes.
pushing against what is rather than allowing what is to be. And sometimes
Mm-hmm.
that means not pushing. From between 2000 and 2005, I spent 5 years writing a memoir about a trip I'd taken with my father. It got good feedback from the people I showed it to, really good. And I listened to a gut that said, don't publish this. And part
Mm-hmm.
of it at the time was insecurity. Part I now see was I had written the wrong story. I always recommend Vivian Gornick's book, The Situation and the Story, to
Yes.
like every client. And that was the feedback I got from an editor was this is a dark comedy. It kind of needs to be shifted that way. My point is I didn't pursue publication, even though it might have gotten it, who knows. But no, it was last year or 2 years ago, I pulled a scene from that and put it in an essay. So I still can use all that material elsewhere. The other thing I love telling clients is nothing ever goes to waste. And one of my
Yes.
favorite stories about this is there's a TV show called The Good Place.
Mm-hmm.
It's on Netflix now. And I don't watch a lot of stuff, but I love that show. And Mike Schur, there was a podcast that went with it. And I started out wanting to be a comedy writer. And so I loved listening to the podcast. And the writing team, whenever they cut anything, they put it in something that Mike Schur called the candy jar.
Oh, I love that
And I
name.
really like it. And then when they needed, so for any joke, let's say any laugh line, you create maybe 20 or 30, what they call, you brainstorm a bunch and then cut them down. So you have 4 or 5 alts that are what are recorded,
Mm-hmm.
along with the main line. And then in the edit suite, you can decide which one you want to use. And, put all the alts back in the candy jar and just use them for something else. I just love that. And mine is far less creatively titled. I just call it my outtakes file. But it tricks my brain into believing that I'm not really cutting something. I'm just
Mm-hmm.
moving it. I'm rearranging the furniture for now. But it's still here, and that helps to trick my writerly ego that's like, but I need that paragraph. I love that sentence.
Oh my goodness. I'm thinking of all the sentences that I have absolutely loved and had to cut. And that idea of the candy jar, I think I'm going to borrow that because it really is a sweet way to talk about writing that is precious to us,
Yeah.
that we don't want to get rid of. Because one thing that I find I will fall into, and I know a lot of writers will fall into, is what's called the sunk cost fallacy.
Yes.
So the sunk cost fallacy is that if I put time into it, I have to finish it or I have to get it to some completion point. Otherwise, it's a failure. But the
Right.
reality is, if you've put that work in and it's not working, putting more into something that isn't what you're supposed to be doing
Yeah.
isn't helpful.
Right.
So allow it to be like, yes, that's a sunk cost and I can move on. And giving yourself permission is so important.
It is. I mean, it's kind of like saying if a relationship ends, it was worthless. And it's not,
Right.
because you came together for a period of time. You each brought something to it. You each took things away from it. And same with writing is if you
Yes.
spent that time honing your craft, it's not wasted. And I have along this lines an essay that I wrote a few years ago that I've never been able to place. It's far and away the best thing I've written. But that's okay. When we were talking earlier, you were talking about authors taking their books to be their identity.
Yes.
When I was younger, I was a super ambitious creative. That was my whole identity, and I couldn't
Mhm.
imagine not doing it. And we are all so much more than we believe we are, than we've been conditioned to believe that we are. And even as writers, we are so much more than our output. I mean, I think that's one of the capitalist framings. Productivity is not a moral imperative. It's just not. It's, contributing to the well-being of the collective. Yeah, that is. But it is hard to see other people who are really taking it so much as, this is who I am.
Mhm. Yeah, and I was listening to actually a podcast episode this morning when I was lifting weights, being all brutally first thing in the morning. Actually, at 5:45, I
Ooh,
bowed to myself because that normally does not happen. I do not get up that early, except perimenopause.
yes.
And you have those moments where you're like, blink, I'm awake
Yep.
and there's nothing you can do about it. So it was one of those days. But I was listening to this podcast episode from Off the Grid, which is a podcast about getting off social media. And
Mm,
I'm fascinated by this. And this episode was on being seen and how important that is for us to understand what it means to be seen and to find the places where we are seen, and how social media can create this false sense of being seen,
yeah.
and that it skews our understanding of what's important. Like we start thinking about metrics and all of this other stuff.
Oh, yeah.
But one of the things that happens on social media that's actually decreasing our capacity for being seen and also decreasing our happiness is the level of comparison. comparing ourselves to people's, hot takes and their highlight reels and all of these other things.
Yeah.
And I'm sharing this because you are taking a different path with your Substack, the Counterintuitive Guide to Living. And, when we talked before, you told me that you've been doing this since 2012, an important year for me as well. And it was a passion project for a long time. And now you're like, I know what this has to be.
Yes.
So, can you tell us more about that?
Yeah. So to give a little backstory, I was your typical like high achieving type A, anxious creative. And in between 2007 and around late 2009, early 2010, I had a complete breakdown. I had moved across the country for a job that didn't fit me, but I
Mhm.
couldn't see that. I had already been deeply suicidal when I was in Toronto, and it just got way worse when I moved to Vancouver because I just didn't have any of my people around. I was working in a type of job. I mean, it really wasn't corporate, but it was marketing. I mean, creative writers were at the top of the org chart, which was fantastic,
Wow.
but it was still like it was an office and there were politics and dynamics, and the only thing really that kept me alive was my cat, because I knew that
Mhm.
if I ended my life, she wouldn't understand.
Mhm.
Um, and so then I moved again. And in early 2010, out of all this pain, I had this sudden epiphany that sort of ties into what I said earlier, that a lot of what we take to be reality isn't,
Mhm.
it's conditioning.
Yes.
And that what really matters in this world is not achievement and accomplishment and being important, which is how I had been conditioned. Got to be
Mhm.
important, but was really about growing on the inside and becoming more
Yes.
compassionate and kind. And at the same time, like it was just this really literally mind blowing epiphany. And at the same time, I had very little work. Like everything in my life had fallen away. And I was
Mhm.
in a new town. This one I really loved. And I just didn't, it's like, I don't recognize my life anymore.
Mhm.
And it's kind of like, who am I? I mean, it comes back to the writing thing. It's like, who am I if I'm not a writer? And
Yeah.
I just became really determined to practice all the things I was learning and to really, Eckhart Tolle has this great phrase, if you get the inside right, the outside will fall into place. And
Mhm.
so that became like my life just became an experiment. I want to say I stopped writing creatively for 3 years because I had been a personal essay writer and a memoirist, and everything in my life had been, oh, it's hilarious or it's terrible or how could he? Everything kind of was a judgment on what had happened. And those judgments had wired my brain to make me really angry at myself. The same pathways that allowed me to judge other people. And I'm not saying people shouldn't do that because, we're humans. And that
Mhm.
is what essays are about, is kind of like, this is what this situation is. So I stopped writing creative stories, essays,
Mhm.
for several years because I wanted to train my mind away from making stories that made me unhappy. So
Mm.
in other words, I wasn't able to separate the skill, and it's part of essay writing, of
Yeah.
interpreting a situation. That skill had also led to me over interpreting other situations. She hates me. I'm terrible. I'm a loser. I'm ugly. I took all of that as fact because as an essayist, I was taking my interpretation of a story as
Yeah.
fact. And that's the other reason I love Vivian Gornick, because that's true for all of us. We have millions of data points. What is the story? I just started having insights and I started taking notes and writing them. And a friend said to me, we were in a coffee shop, and he said, most people spend their lives like being so busy and running away, like doing, shopping or eating or having sex or anything not to
Mhm.
feel existential despair. And he said,
Yeah.
but you're living the mess. And I loved that. So that was the first title. It's not anymore. So much of our pain comes from trying to make things not messy or trying to control the mess. And the thing is, if we just allow it to be, unfold on its own.
Mhm.
So living the mess I wrote it and I was literally writing my own resilience because I was writing blog posts. The early ones are really just about me and what I was experiencing. Even though I grew up in an affluent family, I spent several years below survival level, like
Mm.
relying on a food bank, bartering for food. So, there were a few people reading it. And I kept, off and on. I just felt like this is where I want to be focused.
Mm-hmm.
And then a whole bunch of other stuff happened. Like my first gift book came out, and I started doing more work, and work came back. And I didn't feel the same passion. And so a teacher that I work with said, try meditating on it. And I did. And I saw that it needed to be two things. One is that the title, Living the Mess, wasn't appealing enough because the people who understand that title don't need what's in it.
Mm-hmm.
And one of my early contenders had been The Counterintuitive Guide to Life. And I love the rhythm, and it was a little tongue in cheek because who am I to say I have the guide to life? Like, of course I don't. But for a while I was saying, it's kind of like Weird Barbie.
Mm-hmm.
And the other part was that I realized it needed to be a handbook of skills for skillfully navigating. This life is nothing but a series of paradoxes.
Right.
And we tend to make a decision. This is right and that's wrong, but it's both and.
Yes.
And so there are certain skills needed to navigate all this, like learning to observe your thoughts, which comes back to what I do with writing clients, coaching clients. Learning to separate facts from our interpretations of those
Mm-hmm.
facts is so key. And these are all ongoing practices. And so I knew that it had a new name. My big challenge was life painted me into a corner to do this work. And when people are comfortable, there's not much incentive to do a lot of deep personal work,
Right.
because everything's groovy.
Yeah.
And I just needed to get out of pain. I was in so much pain that I just needed to find a way out. People, including me, don't make an effort to change when things are comfortable.
Yes.
And I don't know necessarily how to reach, generally speaking, people who are uncomfortable. Like for a
Mm-hmm.
long time, the tagline was inner peace for overthinkers, because that certainly captures it. But then this fall, like many people, I felt this kind of gut punch, like,
Yeah.
holy fuck, like, what just happened? And people started telling me things like, they finally stopped watching the news.
Mm-hmm.
For years, I've avoided or minimized how much I watch. And I suddenly went, oh, there are a whole lot of people in a whole lot of pain right now.
Yeah.
And, it's not that we need to wait another 4 years or however long to create a different kind of world. We can do it simultaneously.
Mm-hmm.
And these are the skill sets for that kind of world. I wish I could be one of those people who says, oh, just think happy thoughts. And, because I see complexity everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
It takes dedication and it takes commitment, but the reward is so great. I think now I've suddenly felt like now I can see that this has a purpose.
Yes.
So again, for writers listening, that's 13 years of not knowing where I was going with this. And it may never become a book, we'll see.
And even if it doesn't, what I love about Substack and the work that you do is that it is helping people now, and it has the capacity to help people more as you process this and you think about, well, what does it mean to live in a counterintuitive way, or to think about those counterintuitive ways of living, so that we can create the world we want now, regardless of what's going on. And I think that's so important to think about when it comes to writing, because so many people want to have the perfect conditions. I want to have the perfect amount of time. I want to have the perfect amount of noise or quiet, the perfect pen, the perfect blah, 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 blah. The reality is, we write in the middle of
Of
imperfect
life.
circumstances all the time.
Yeah.
And our understanding of our stories is always imperfect. It's always growing. We could publish something and it's brilliant for now, and then we're going to grow in some way and we're going to look at it differently.
Right.
So, yeah, being able to live in the now as it is and create what you need is so important. And I think, one of the questions that some of the listeners have been coming to me with is about editing. Like, how do I edit my work? How do I edit my work?
Mm,
And I think there are a lot of counterintuitive ways to edit work, because when we think about editing, we always think about what is happening on the page, and do I have enough active verbs, and is the pacing right? And those things are all important.
yeah.
But there's an inner work we need to do when
Yes.
we are editing, as well as this outer work. When I talk about outer work, for anyone who's listening and they're not sure what I mean, I'm talking about the ways that we change what's on the page. That is valuable, but there's more to it. And as you think about the inner work that we have to do, as writers, and how it relates to counterintuitive living, what do you think about that? What's the work?
I have noticed with my clients that whatever energy is going on inside them, I will feel it on the
Mm,
page. So to me, the inner work, it's taking time away. In art, there's white space, right?
yes.
And we need to kind of cleanse the palette of our brains,
Mm-hmm.
and just so that we can come back and look at it with fresh eyes. I am a huge fan of what I call coffee shop edits because I tend to edit in a different location than I write. And that helps me see things differently. And people would be really shocked at how little of my revision time is actually spent hands on keyboard or pen to paper of my own. Like when I'm editing, of course, I'm focused on the client's work, but I'll go for a walk for
Yes.
an hour and I'll sit down in a coffee shop, or if it's nice, I'll sit down outside. And right now I'm mostly writing newsletters. So they're under 2,000 words. And I'll take a quick pass and I'll notice 5 or 10 things, maybe not even that many. And then I'll put it back in my bag and go for another walk.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'll sit down. And when I know that I'm just sitting down for one pass on a short piece, so for a memoirist, it might be a chapter or even part of a chapter, a big scene, then that takes the pressure off. I just am looking to see if there's anything I want to change.
Mm-hmm.
The caveat is when I get close to the end, I always thought it was just me, but I'm sensing that this is very common. I develop somatically kind of an agitation or a little bit of irritability. That to me is the clue that it's time to really sit down and get this to the finish line. And I'm not talking hours, I'm talking maybe an hour.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's a little internal click. It's like a key in a lock and it goes, okay, that's done. It's done. Like I feel a sensation in my solar plexus. So that's a little more intensive. But for the majority of my revising time, it's going for walks or, playing with dogs. What it isn't in between, the inner work is looking at social media, which
Yes.
I look forward to the day I can hire someone to do social media for me. Because as editors and writers, right now we have to be on it, but God, I hate it. I mean, I love connecting with friends, but yeah. So that's the inner. And then did you ask also about the outer? I forgot.
Yeah. So we're going to get into the outer in a moment, but I want to comment on a couple of things that you shared. Two strategies that I hear are focus on one thing, get up, move around, look at things in a different location because that gives you a fresh perspective. And also notice, what is my inner landscape? How am I feeling? And if I'm getting to that point where what I say is like, I'm sick of it, like that's my thing. It's like when you're sick of it, it's probably done. And then do that really hardcore final edit. And you said something that was really important. You knew it was done when you felt it in your solar plexus. And I
Yeah.
have that same experience of I feel it in my solar plexus, and it also feels like a sigh, like this sigh of relief.
Yes. Yeah. It's kind of like, oh, wow. I thought I had like hours more. Oh, it's done. It's almost like a
Yes.
surprise. It's like, oh, okay.
Right. And I always tell people, think about it in that way. Whereas what we often are looking at is, oh, the deadline is here, or, I want to get this done by such and such date. And there's nothing wrong with that. And there are going to be times if you are writing professionally where the deadline has arrived and you have to send it off. That's the way it is. But if it's your most tender work, the work that matters to you most, it's really important to wait for the sigh, wait for that
Yeah.
feeling. And what I often tell people, and that's a little counterintuitive, is that your internal critic can be your friend at a certain
Yes.
point in the
Yes.
writing process. But here's where it often goes awry in early drafts. And I actually teach people these skills in classes. It's on building creative intuition because your intuition, it does so much for you. And on top of that, it's a way that you can really see things differently and begin to see where the lies are because our inner critic
Yes.
will tell us so many lies.
Oh,
And
yeah.
the biggest lie that I've found that people have is that number one, it has to all be done in one shot. And it doesn't. As you're hearing, it's draft, 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 draft. But also that a lot of work has to happen in order for you to get to the truth. But what often happens is that in a first draft, it's raw, it's messy. Yes, things need to be changed, but there can be this grain of truth. And sometimes what happens is our inner critic says, that sucks. That's not right. You need to get rid of that. Nobody wants to hear about this thing.
Oh,
And
yeah.
what I've had people do is assess their work. What feels like it's great? What feels like it sucks completely and should be taken out? And what do you have questions about? Analyze a piece like that and then read it out loud to someone else and listen to
Yeah.
what they have to say. And I have found so many cases where the writer was certain that this one part was terrible and it absolutely needed to be taken out. And it was the best part of their
Yeah.
work. And the problem is that there's a problem of calibration inside you in terms of truth. And what's happened is they've hit their vulnerability.
Right.
And so I find that these things are so important that it's often very different than what we think it's going to be. So we need to think in new ways. And when we
Yeah.
do that, it leads to what we put on the page.
Right. I mean, vulnerability, thank God for Brene Brown. But I mean,
Yes.
vulnerability is one of those things that is dismissed by the culture and yet is the key, like the key to resonant writing.
Yes.
Yeah. And so for a lot of people, that's a big shift to make. It's not about being clever. Like
Mm-hmm.
cleverness is kind of a dime a dozen. Yeah, my 20-year-old self would scream to hear me say that. But vulnerability, we're all going through this human experience, you
Right.
know? And we all have things we don't share with other people. By letting us see that, you're inviting us into that world. I wanted to mention a technique I use, which is just negotiating with my inner critic. And I think it's gotten easier for me over the years just because I've been doing it a long time. But
Mm-hmm.
it's basically saying to the inner critic when I sit down to draft something, okay, you're going to have your chance, but right now I need you to go sit in a corner over there.
Yes.
Because as one of the things I was saying, I think before we started recording, is when I was really young, I used to say my best writing doesn't go through my head.
Yes.
It starts in my heart, it goes down my arm and out my pen. And so the inner critic has a role, but it's not in creating, it's in
Yes.
revising. And it really, it's trying to protect us,
Of
it's telling
course.
us people don't want to hear this because we've been told. I mean, I grew up in a family that demonized any kind of inner work.
Mm-hmm.
The intellect was everything. And that was the only thing, like that and being important
Right.
were, being smart and being important were the only things that mattered. So, learning these ways of opening up, what's remarkable to me is that, as you said with your client, when we take those risks, there's almost always, a really positive response.
Yes.
Because as we change, the world around us changes. It both appears to change and it really does change.
Mm-hmm. I love that.
I don't know if you encounter over revising. I will
Oh,
often.
yes. And I have over revised way too much.
I have a friend who's also a writer and editor. And So she'll look over some of my stuff, and she has this great phrase. She said, "Don't overcook the souffle." And I
Oh, I love
love
that.
that. Yeah. And it's so catchy that it's like, yeah, there is that solar plexus, yes, but if you keep pushing beyond that, it's all going to fall, you know.
Yes, and it will. I'm going to put that in my office. Don't overcook the souffle. That is such a great line. These are all of the internal things that we do in order
Right.
to both prepare to revise and to revise itself. And you work with writers. So, what's an exercise that you give writers to help them clarify or sharpen what's on the page?
There are a couple. One is I do this in general with most clients. I ask them what location or activity brings them, a sense of peace.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it's people on the coast will say the beach, other people will say, playing with my dog. So doing that before they sit down. And that's inner. Outer, for me, like I mostly do that in like the skills part in our
Mm-hmm.
calls or in the markup I do. But I also will tell people to go into nature and do some sense exercises. Focus on the smell and what does
Mm-hmm.
that bring up. By sharpening their senses, they can bring that back onto the page within the context of whatever it is they're writing about.
Yeah, I love that. Our senses are so powerful, and especially our sense of smell and our sense of taste. It can be so evocative. I mean, I always think
Yeah.
about Proust and his Madeleine, that
Right.
whole story, but it is true. It is one of the quickest ways to get to our unconscious and to all of these things below the surface of our understanding. These are just some of the tools that you want to bring to the table so that people can take a look at their work. So I love the senses. Another thing that I'll use is I'll give people an assignment to go watch videos,
Ah, yeah.
especially when I see this happens a lot. So everyone, don't get judgy. Okay. Don't get judgy on me and don't get judgy on yourself. We all read drafts filled with roiling and boiling tummies, clenched jaws, furrowed brows, name something else.
Or cliche or elevated voice.
Yes. That's a normal part of the writing process. And that's some of the stuff that we want to strip away. But, if you are stuck and you're like, but my stomach was messed up, which of course it was if you were really upset about something and you're writing about personal things, or you're thinking about a character and trying to use your own experience. But there are so many other more subtle and unique ways to express emotion. And so if you look at videos, that's a great way to do that.
Ah, yeah. I often tell people, this is the difference between writing and speaking is
Yes.
even right now, you and I can see each other. We can see how the other person's responding, facial expressions, intonations, and none of that is on the page. So
Right.
the writer has to make up for that by really letting us experience through their body as a sensing organ. I mean, that sounds a little body snatcher, but look through their eyes, listen through their ears. And just to the point of the sense memory exercises, I wrote an article about that, about how nature helps memoirists remember. It was for Writer's Digest in the July issue this year, so I think it's still available as an archive issue. But there are specific exercises in that issue that I lay out that you can do in nature to help bring up more.
Well, I will definitely put that in the show notes so people can take a look
Thanks.
at that because you have so many wonderful exercises and you've given us all of this great writing wisdom. So I don't know if you have one last, oh, this is my best piece of writing advice or the best piece of writing advice someone has told me. If you don't, you can say pass because we've already covered so much. But then we'll get into my last two lightning round questions.
Okay. Um, the best piece of advice, I think I just said it, was the first time I sold an essay, an editor said to me, you're telling this to me as though you're standing at the door listening to what's happening in the room and describing it. I need you to bring me inside the room with you. So I go a little bit further and say, let us look through your eyes. But
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that was one line of feedback that I've carried with me for 25 years.
I'm going to be keeping that with me as well. That's a great piece of feedback.
Okay.
And so We are preparing. Well, this is being recorded before 2025 begins. I
We have
always
no
record
idea what's
everything.
going to happen.
Right. We,
Yeah.
we have no idea what life is going to be like. And we're in a preparatory phase. So, how are you nurturing your resilience as you work on your counterintuitive guide to life and all of the other writing projects you're working on and your work with other writers?
This is the other thing I wanted to say anyway, which is for me, 2025 is a year of transformation. I'm preparing to move to a city about 90 minutes away. Not super far, but it's speaking of being in a different place and looking at material differently.
Yeah.
So there are physical things I'm doing. I'm creating some courses, which I've never done before, and probably going to have some group programs, which I haven't tried before. So there's that. But on the inside, going slowly so that I don't burn out.
Hmm.
Because as we were talking about before, it takes so much longer to recover from burnout. I mean, it
Yes.
took me years and years to recover. But if we take care of ourselves along the way and we stop before we bonk, which is a cycling
Hmm.
phrase for like nothing left, then we have more sustenance to keep going. It's more sustainable. That's my resilience part. And then again, yeah, we'll see what happens with the courses.
Speaking of your courses, what are the best ways for people to connect with you, to engage with you, and especially to learn more about what you're up to so that whether your courses are ready when this airs or later, because people will be listening to this along
Yes.
the way, where can they get updates?
The central hub, like the easiest thing to remember is that my name is my website, sarahchauncey.com. And from there, you can find each of my 3 newsletters. Resonant Storytelling is my newsletter for writers. The Counterintuitive Guide to Life, which is my project as a writer. And the More Than Tuna newsletter, which is very occasionally, but for people experiencing pet loss. I would say Instagram, which is Sarah K. Chauncey, is probably, I don't know. I'm not on social that much, and I am trying to pare back. So I think my website kind of gives you pointers to all the places where I am. But I look forward to hearing from anybody, and, please subscribe to the Substacks if it speaks to you.
And I definitely hope they do because I subscribe and I love getting your messages in my inbox and I always learn something new from
Thanks.
them. So I'm currently meditating on the pain body and I will share that as one of the links. And so if
Okay.
you really want to engage with Sarah and you're like, oh my gosh, I didn't get all those things, fear not. All of it is in the show notes. So you will have lots of ways to get in touch with Sarah and to learn about her incredible work. Well, I want to thank you so much for being on the show today. It has been an absolute pleasure.
I've had so much fun, Lisa. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for such a great conversation.
If you'd like to learn more about Sarah and sign up for her Substacks, The Counterintuitive Guide to Life and Resonant Storytelling, please see the show notes for this episode. But before you go, text the show on Apple Podcast or Spotify, or leave a comment on YouTube with the editing tip you plan to add to your writing practice. And speaking of comments, thank you, Stephanie Shaffrin, for your recent YouTube comment about my interview with Amy Robeson on the Akashic Records. I'm so glad that episode spoke to you. That's it for today's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. I truly couldn't do this podcast without your support. If you love this episode, here are 3 simple ways you can keep this show thriving. 1, subscribe or follow Writing Your Resilience on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube so you never miss an episode. 2, leave a 5-star review to help others discover the podcast. 3, join my engaged writing community by signing up for the Writing Your Resilience newsletter. As a thank you, you'll receive a free copy of Write More, Fret Less, a toolkit for gaslight proofing your writing practice. Have feedback for the show, a topic you'd love me to cover, or questions you'd like me to answer? Drop a comment on YouTube, text the show, or email me at writingyourresiliencepodcast@gmail.com. Until next time, keep writing, keep growing, and keep showing up for yourself. Your story matters, and I am so proud to be writing alongside you.